Okay, so it looks like most of us are here now. So I'm going to start by introducing, first I will start by introducing myself. My name is Alonzo Toloza, and I am a first year MA student here at Lehigh University. And just to give you some background, some of my interests include multilingual education in connection to identity formation and kind of the forced cultural assimilation that immigrants face when they come to the United States. And I'm very excited to be here and to learn more about the Latinx community here in the Lehigh Valley, as well as the whole state of Pennsylvania. So I hope you enjoy your time with us. I'm going to get started by introducing our two speakers for this segment. So first, I will start with our host, Dr. Marilisa Jimenez. Dr. Jimenez is a professor of comparative literature at Lehigh University, and she's the founding director and principal investigator of the task force of the Institute of Critical Race Theory and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. Then we also have Mary Mitstarfer. She's currently working in a postdoc here at Lehigh University, and she's working for the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies as well with Dr. Marilisa Jimenez and doing studies in how justice collaborate. So we'll get started first with Dr. Jimenez.
Hello, hello, welcome all. How can everyone hear me? I just also want everyone to know that we're recording. So if for whatever reason you don't feel comfortable being on camera, whatever reason, you can turn off your camera, and feel free to do that. We will be also sharing these later with those who weren't able to come. So I'm just quickly going to share my screen. Okay, so welcome to the opening frameworks panel with myself and Dr. Mitzdarffer. It's an honor to be here with you, Dr. Mitzdarffer, by the way. It's always just like a pleasure to be in the space. And thank you, Alonzo, for introducing us. I also want to remind everyone that if you're to mute yourself, just in case, during the presentation. I'm doing a little bit of everything today. So I'm like tech and presenting and managing the panels as well. So forgive me if I'm a little micromanaging right now. But welcome. It's great to also see some familiar faces here. So I'm just like excited to see, for example, Nadia, I can see you, some students from the past also. Dr. Dowdy, who I used to work with at Hunter, is here, and that's just amazing, and some amazing community members who are also here with us. And I just want to say this has been a labor of love to put together, really. It's been amazing also to work with our community members who have reached out to us to help see this symposium come through. And I want to give a special shout out to Guillermo Lopez, Wilberto Sicard, who's actually a speaker later today, but has just been an amazing community member and scholar helping us put this together. Janine Carambeau from Bethlehem Area Library. Delia Marrero, I don't know what we would have done without Delia Marrero, and Dayanara, who's her daughter. And we recently met also Kumari Davis and just other folks who have joined the conversation on racial and ethnic justice in the Lehigh Valley. So thank you so much, all of you who have helped curate this conversation and this symposium. And what I want to do is just give some context and some ideas and promises about like what the symposium is, how we started, and also why we're doing this, what were some of the real concerns here. Okay, so first I want to do, the first thing I want to do is welcome you all to the ICRES, the Institute on Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, which is the space that we're in. This is the space that was organized by students and faculty of color, and we're here because of student activists on our campus that had said that there needed to be a research institute at Lehigh University on racial justice and connecting scholars of color and building and mentoring amongst each other, and then also working in these areas in the community. So I just want to make sure we're aware of that. And I have the pleasure of working with Dr. Syria Lang, who is the director of the Health Justice Initiative. And I know she's here, so I'm just really thankful for her presence and her leadership. And that goofy grin at the bottom, that's me with our two co-founders, student co-founders, Ruben Rosas and Kevalis Matthews Alvarado, who are now alumni. And Kevalis still works with us. So she's our archivist now in the Student Activist Project. And then here's just a smaller Zoom meeting of us getting together and working and thinking through the things and projects that we want to do. Our logo was also designed by Ruben. So we're completely co-led by students and faculty of color, established in March 2019. So part of what we've been doing in the Edjustice Collaborative is thinking about how to build Latinx studies in the Lehigh Valley. And because I'm someone who's really interested in K through 12, I started at the K through 12 level. Obviously, I'm a professor at Lehigh, and I was the first Latina studies professor here. So I've been working with, obviously the higher education structure, but really thinking about like how to bring these tools into the community and the K through 12 area, which is something I did also in New York City and in Miami and that kind of thing. And this is something we've been doing, like we've been working for a year now with teachers all over the country, but definitely Bethlehem Area School District has been in the house. Vivian Robledo, Doctora Vivian, who is also a speaker, has been very instrumental through these workshops. And this is the last workshop, for example, that we did with Ileana Jimenez. But something that started to happen through these workshops was that community members and other faculty would come and say, hey, we want more of these workshops, but we would like them in different spaces. Like, what about, maybe I'm not an educator, but I feel like I need this conversation outside of the space. So we started thinking about that. And actually in the summer, we had more people approaching us about a symposium. Like, what if we did a symposium? What if we put together a group of panels on community education, on research, and brought back alumni, for example, had community members also in the conversation. And so we started to think about it, and that's basically where we are today, and that's kind of where this has come from. Okay, so building Latino studies in Lehigh Valley, right? Like, what does that really mean? What does it mean to have a conversation about Latino studies here? And to say, for example, that I was the first Latino studies hire at Lehigh in 2016, right? So it's a relatively new even area within the conversation in the university. And I remember when I first came here, when I was being recruited to Lehigh and like driving by the Bethlehem Steel Factory and learning that a lot of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans had worked in that factory under some really difficult conditions, right? And learning also about the legacy of like African Americans, being stigmatized through that process as well. And I got the feeling that there was just like a legacy of a lot of kind of hurts and divisions and that kind of thing. But I was also really inspired to learn that there was such a strong community of color in this area, and specifically a community that represented, the Puerto Rican community, which is something that I have always studied in my own heritage. And then actually one of the first times that I came to Bethlehem was to visit Donegan Elementary School with another researcher who invited me. And it's interesting because I remember talking to Sonia Vasquez. So that's a picture of some Donegan students in the slide. Sonia Vasquez, who is no longer the principal, right? But I remember telling her that I was hired at Lehigh. And she's also Boricua. And I remember her saying like, Mija, I'm so proud of you, and sort of this idea of like, that I was the first one, of the community in a way, the way that she saw it. It was really something that touched me. And I've always sort of carried that with me, whether it's a burden, whether it's a good thing, it's something that I've always thought about every time I walk on campus. Also thinking like, how can I have my campus look more like the people I see outside of the campus, right? And so this is a picture I took recently of a Puerto Rican flag in Bethlehem. And during those moments where maybe I don't feel like I belong, we all have them. And sort of seeing a picture like that always reminds me like there's a reason I'm here. So who is here? Who is in Pennsylvania, right? That's something that I've always thought about too. So something that Dr. Mitzdarffer and I also talked about, right, with this idea of like the Hispanic population and like not necessarily really being specific or culturally relevant to understanding who those communities are. And this is a graphic I got from the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, which is accessible on their website, on their dashboard. And it was really interesting to see, if we're looking at the state of Pennsylvania and we're looking at who the Hispanics are in Pennsylvania, when we really look at the breakdown of what that is in terms of that population, you have 48.93% Puerto Rican, right? And a lot of that is the legacy of laborers and factory workers and, sewing factories, and really a legacy of the 1950s programs in Puerto Rico and the US to depopulate Puerto Rico. A lot of us don't know that history. And it's interesting because we have such a critical mass of this community in our schools as well, right? After that, we have a 12.79% Dominican Republic. Mexican is 16.8%, right? So thinking through, like, are we being really culturally relevant in our curriculum? Are these communities that are represented in our higher education programs, in our schooling systems, and also understanding that a lot of these communities might also identify as Afro-Boricua, which is something that we've been looking at, or Afro-Latinx, right? So understanding that it's not just like this one kind of identity. So are we being relevant to who's here? And why do I care so much about Edjustice? That's something I wanted to make sure I said today. And, not just because it's something I've studied, but also something I've lived, and I was really taken aback listening to a lot of the stories over this symposium of school discrimination and people really talking about policies that they had faced. And I couldn't help but think about, like, little Marilisa in Florida, which is where I was raised. And sort of like not understanding in the context of the South that I was living in at the time. So I identify sort of as New York, Miami Rican, so like New York and Miami and Florida. But I understand, for example, my middle school is a place, Jefferson Davis Middle School. Amen. It was torn down recently from what I hear. So it's interesting that maybe perhaps I didn't even understand that I was like going to middle school in a place that was celebrating a Confederate leader, at the time. But I remember being put in courses for special education, for example, because of my last name and because I was bilingual. And I remember sitting in tables with students and not being given anything to read, not giving anything, no paper, and I remember just talking to other students and being like, what are you doing in this class? And we don't do anything. You just don't worry, you just sit and you wait till the bell rings. And I remember being in classrooms like that because of my last name, and having to have my parents write a letter and say, hey, our daughter wants to go to college one day. Why are you putting her in these classes? So the issue of being sort of like systematically underestimated is very much part of the work that I do and part of what I think about. So where are we in Pennsylvania and ethnic studies, for example, and really trying to get a sense of the climate, and thinking through also, like, should it be that a student has to go to college in order to read a Latino author or read an African-American author, right? And that's often the conversations we have even with our teachers when they say, well, the first time was in college. So thinking through a curriculum pipeline, but understanding too that currently in Pennsylvania, we are experiencing a moment where there's a backlash against anti-racism, and there's a fear of critical race theory and legislation to really curtail conversations on anti-racism. And as recently as last month, there was a ban on books in York, Pennsylvania, also nearby in Northampton, Pennsylvania. So this is interesting because it's actually a group of students that have been leading these conversations about reversing these book bans. And it's just been a really interesting thing to think about for me. What some of the books also that were banned in New York specifically were Latinx books, and books for children and books for teachers specifically. So, that book by Monica Brown about Tito Puente was seen as problematic. The Elizabeth Acevedo book, Clap When You Land, about Dominican immigrants in New York City, also banned. De Donde Eres by Yamil Said Mendez, a story about immigration, beautiful story, was seen as problematic. And then also the textbook En Comunidad by Carla España, Luz Yadira Herrera, which is about teaching bilingual children, right? also seen as problematic and also part of the ban. So something I'm thinking and have been thinking about also in these conversations is that we have to change the game. Like, right, what does it mean to do Latino studies in PA? What does it mean to do Latino studies nationally? But Latino studies in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, Asian American studies, that if we're doing Latino studies, it shouldn't be seen that we're somehow taking away from an other, ethnic community, but also understanding the racial solidarities that exist between these communities. We have a lot of Latinx people who identify as Asian. We have a lot of Latinx people who identify as Black. A lot of this has to do with our not understanding of what it means to be Latinx, right? And thinking about pathways and not bridges. That's why the symposium is called Pathways. I'm not feeling the idea of calling our youth bridges. Bridges are things we step on, right? Pathways are when we clear a road and we allow folks to go forward. So I'm interested in building pathways. I'm not interested in building bridges. Promises and not problems, that our young people are not problems that we have to solve, that they have a lot of potential and promise, and how can we tap into that promise? Equity and not just inclusion, right? So not just about adding a unit or adding a book or adding something to the syllabus, but actually an integral purpose here of looking at it as a vision of equity between our communities. And our students are at an advantage and not at a disadvantage. Does that make sense? So this is obviously coming from some of the research I've done and stuff that I also teach in my classes, but this is from Eve Tuck, Suspending Damage, encountering this idea of like deficit discourses, right? Where she writes that in doing community research, we have to really think about considering damage-centered research, right? Research that intends to document people's pain and brokenness to hold those in power accountable for their oppression. This kind of research operates with a flawed theory of change. It is often used to leverage reparations or resources for marginalized communities, yet simultaneously reinforces and reinscribes a one-dimensional notion of these people as depleted, ruined, and hopeless. So this is something I always think about when we do work with communities, right? That we're not approaching them as damaged, that we're not going in and thinking that we're the ones that have all the solutions, but that they have a lot to bring to the conversation. And we're trying to resist that here in our work that we do. So guiding questions for us are in the program, if you have the program for today that you can download, thinking through, right, like what about methods and epistemologies that Latinx communities bring to the academy? Where are we in the curriculum in higher ed? Where are we in K through 12? Where is the story about our research? How can we resist anti-Blackness in Latinx research and communities? How can we resist the homogenous Hispanic idea about who is in our PA area? Stories of displacement, gentrification, ed, and health disparities, but also creativity and agency of Latinos or Latinx's, Lehigh Valley to Philadelphia. Recommendations for research, for ethical ways to involve and support community needs, and starting with the community as an intellectual space, right? What do communities want to learn? What do they want to see happen? How can they be more centered in terms of the conversation? How can we remain critical and self-reflective of the role of the university and its involvement in gentrification of the Lehigh Valley? And specifically also resisting the savior complex, right? And I mean this in all ways. Like, I know we talk a lot about white saviors, but we can be Latina saviors too, always thinking that because we have PhDs, we're the ones that have the solutions. And I think you've heard that throughout my presentation, really. So I want to end on this note. The resources that I used to put together this symposium, and also things that I'm still learning from community thought leaders. And these are projects that have been going on in the Lehigh Valley. So one is Estoy Aquí, Latina Women of the Lehigh Valley, which was done through Lafayette College. And it puts together podcasts and storytelling and oral histories from Latinas in the community. And I thought it was beautiful. Actually, Miranda Natalia, who is one of the storytellers, is one of our moderators. Black in Bethlehem Project, Raya Levy, right? I've been looking at these stories. I think it's beautiful and amazing work. And then also Wilberto Sicard's work that he did while he was here at Lehigh Valley on City with Limits, right? On Allentown and education and residential segregation, inequality. So thinking through also how our young people and our students and community leaders have actually led the research in many ways that we can benefit from. And that's the story I have to tell for you today. And now, Dr. Mitzdarffer.
You would think after a few months of Zoom culture, I would learn how to unmute myself. But hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me today. My name is Dr. Mary Mitstarfer. I am a postdoctoral research scholar with the Institute for Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, specifically the Health Justice Collaborative under the direction of the brilliant and wonderful Dr. Syria Lang. In that work, we're working on inclusion health and developing a tool of radical welcome, right? Thinking about who is excluded from spaces and how do we start breaking down those barriers. In my own personal work, I really focus on the social determinants of health or the social mechanisms that lead to health, right? So how is education and health really connected? And that's something that I really love about this center. We really think about the structural issues, right? It's not just what's happening in our classroom, it's what's happening in our policy, it's what's happening in our everyday social interactions, and it's what's happening within the health of the nation. So let's talk a little bit about it, okay? So we've all heard the term Latinx. And if you're my family, there was a major ick. My mom's like, I'm Latina, I am Chicana, right? Or Latine or Latino, right? It's a very hotly debated term right now. But really, when we say Latinx, we're trying to create a more inclusive space. Latine is also another term that's come up that's seen as an inclusive space, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just gonna stick with Latinx today. So who is Latinx? Well, Latinx really refers to individuals who come from Latin American countries. So from Central, South, the Caribbean, and Mexico, right? So individuals who share a heritage, who may share a language, who may share culture, who may share customs, right? And so we really saw the rise of Latinos and Latinx in the US over the last 100 years by adding us as an ethnic group. But remember, we're an ethnic group. As Dr. Jimenez said, we are not a racial group. So we really do encompass many different peoples, many different histories, from indigeneity to individuals who, entered Latin America due to the slave trade, due to escaping oppression, to our colonizers, right? And so it's a really interesting space that we occupy as Latinos in the United States. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Latinx in the United States and in PA, touching a bit about population growth, a closer look at Latinx health and health disparities, talking about all of our favorite topics, COVID, and talking about a little bit of a need for more measurement, right? Personally, I come from the southwest side of Chicago. I am the product of a German-American father and a Mexican-American mother. And I think, like many of us, I learned to navigate biculturalism throughout childhood, and it has influenced so much of what I do now. So we know that the Latinx population in the United States is growing. It's the youngest population. And over the last 50 years, we've seen the population really skyrocket. We also know that this population is not growing due to increases in migration. It's actually growing due to increases in birth rate, right? So Latinx women or Latinas are often seen as one of the few racial or ethnic categories that are non-replacement, right? So most racial or ethnic categories try to replace in birth rates, the population that is now, we actually grow. So we know that 90% of Latinx children in the United States are US born citizens. Nearly 80% of Latinx residing in the United States total are US citizens. 1 in 4 Latinx children live in mixed status households or households with one undocumented individual. So what else do we know? Well, thinking about the population of Lehigh and Northampton counties, thinking about it locally, we're seeing rapid changes within these populations. Over the last 10 years, we've seen Latinx growth increase by over 100%, right? So we've seen the white population go from 99% of the population of the Lehigh Valley in the 1970s to about 70% these days. We know that Latinos in Lehigh County make up about 21% of the population. Latinos in Northampton County make up about 12% of the population, which is much higher than Pennsylvania total. Pennsylvania total, the total population of Latinos is about 6%. We also know that the way that we're identifying is changing, right? So we're seeing more and more Latinos identify as Black, right? 14% of Latinos in the Lehigh Valley identify as Black. We're seeing more and more Latinos identify as 2 or more races, 66%. So we're also seeing more Latinos identify just differently, right? As the categories kind of increase. And so we're starting to push for better metrics or better measurement of Latinx health. We also know that the 222 corridor is really important in this area, right? And that the 222 corridor, or the Corazón de la Comunidad, is named after Route 222, and it encompasses places like Easton, Bethlehem, Allentown, Lancaster, Lebanon, York, Harrisburg, and Gettysburg. And it holds more than 50% of the population of Latinos in Pennsylvania. So that's huge, right? This one pathway has 50% of the population. So it's important to start thinking about that more. So what do we know about Lehigh Valley health? Well, we know that Lehigh Valley and Lehigh and Northampton counties account for, they're ranked number 13 and number 11 of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania. So they're actually ranked pretty high. Our citizens have better health than most, right? Life expectancy is around 80 years for both counties, which is higher than the overall life expectancy of Pennsylvania total. Our STD rates are actually pretty on par. Our insured rates are pretty on par. Our health is pretty on par, and our obesity rates are pretty on par. But what does that really tell us? Well, at the local level, we don't really unpack Latinx versus other health, right? But we need to start unpacking it. We know that nationally, Latinos in the United States live to about 82 years of age, compared to their non-Latinx counterparts who live until about 80 years of age. We also know that recent studies, one by Bowen and Hummer in 2019, showed that Latinos, despite living longer, suffer from disease states longer than other populations. And so it's really important to critically think about this population, especially as this population holds such a majority within the areas that we are in now. So we've really seen Latinos in COVID, right? I'm sure we've all heard overall this idea that Black and Brown communities are disproportionately affected by COVID, right? And that has to do with how we work, it has to do with how we live, it has to do with our insurance rates, it has to do with access to information, it has to do with, is that information really accessible, right? But regardless of that, what we know is that Latinx comprise about 26, almost 27% of COVID cases in the United States. More than 122,000 Latinos in the US have died of COVID. And what we actually found last month, a new study was released that Black and Brown children are disproportionately affected by COVID deaths, right? We know that more than half of the children who lost a primary caregiver in the United States are Black and Brown. So what does that say for this population as we move forward? But some positives are, we know that Latinos in Pennsylvania, despite having really dismal death rates and all of these things, are outpacing other populations in terms of vaccination rates. About 51% of Latinos outside of Philadelphia have gotten vaccinated, and that Latinos in Philadelphia itself actually hold the majority of vaccinations. So that's really, really promising, right? The outreach that we can do when we start centering and focusing our communities and prioritizing our community's health. So when we think about this more, we need to start thinking about the social aspects of health, as I was saying, right? It's not just the doctor's visits. It's not just I have COVID now. It's not just that there's suddenly heart disease. We didn't just wake up sick. There are parts of our lives that really influence, from education, which is what we're really centering today, right? We know that Latinos in the United States have the highest high school dropout rate and maintain the highest high school dropout rate, despite the fact that historic numbers of Latinos in the US are going to college, right? And when we think about education, education is so tied to health, from how we're able to access health insurance, to our abilities to pay for things, to the type of work that we will be done when our education is completed. We think about healthcare and quality access. Are there clinics in your neighborhood? Are there people that speak your language? Are you intimidated to go in there, right? We think about our neighborhood and built environment. As Dr. Jimenez was saying before, we know that Bethlehem and Bethlehem Steel brings certain types of structural and environmental factors that can really impede health. We know that individuals who live near industrial sites actually have higher rates of asthma, right? And other types of disease states. We know that social and community contexts really matter. What is often said is the Latino paradox, right? And despite all of these risk factors, why do Latinos live longer? Well, what's really been probed down is how we live intergenerationally within community, within our family structures. And we know that going past 6, 7 generations in familismo, or the centering of family, is still present within Latinos, and that has been shown or linked to health. And we also know that economic stability plays a really big role, right? So we really need to think about health in a more structural way, in a way that we're centering the ways in which we're socially determined to be so. I also argue that Latinidad, or the identification of Latinos, it's very, in scholarly communities, very hotly debated. Latinidad, right? Is it harmful? Is it helpful? This idea that like we're not all under the same bucket. And it's complicated, right? Because we need to start having more textured measurement. So if we look at things like diagnosed diabetes in the United States, if we use the blanket term Latinx, we think about 12.5% of the population has diabetes versus 7.5%. But if we begin to texture by cultural identity or ethnic group, we start seeing changes, right? That this is representative for Puerto Rican Latinos in the United States, but Mexican American Latinos generally have higher rates of diabetes. Cubans generally have lower rates, and so do Central and South Americans, right? Similarly, we can see the same with chronic liver disease. Mexican Americans have higher than other Latinos. Asthma prevalence, Puerto Rican Americans have much higher prevalence of asthma than Mexican Americans. And right, this isn't even including other groups, because we generally bucket Central and South Americans together like, well, it's one country, it's one culture, there's one exposure point, right? We see similar things with infant mortality rates. It's actually higher among Puerto Rican Americans, where if you know about maternal and child health, Latinos in the United States are seen to have more robust or better birth outcomes than white, non-Hispanic, Black, other racial or ethnic groups. But if we were to start thinking about it more better, we would start thinking about who can we help and how can we help better, right? So I think that in a lot of ways, Latinx health and the attention that we're paying to Latinx health is very good, but I think we can do better by centering social determinants of health, by centering the intersections, or as Kimberly Crenshaw termed the term intersectionality, that we sit in terms of gender, in terms of racial identity, in terms of ethnic identity, in terms of sexual identity, all of these things together to start getting a more comprehensive view, especially as Latino children right now in the United States make up the majority minority. So as this population continues to age, and as we start evolving our definition of who gets to be Latino in the United States, we'll be able to actually help with the health of our nation. And that also really starts in schools, right? And that's what we're here to talk about today. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Mary. Let's see, do we, I know we talked about this before, But do we want to have a little bit of responses from the audience before we head off for the rest of the day? What do you think? Okay, Alonzo, let us know what we want to do.
Okay, yeah. So I was actually gonna ask that because it is 10:37, so it looks like we have a few minutes before the scheduled time. I don't know. Would you like to answer some questions for the guest?
Yeah, I think we have some time, maybe a few questions before we head off. And I'm sure folks want to kind of have community a little bit. There's a lot of you here, which I'm very excited about. I'm excited that for this early session, we had like 40 participants. That's amazing. Any reactions or responses, questions?
Hey, good morning, it's Delia. I just wanted to, I caught it a little late, but I just wanted to say, if anybody hasn't read Elizabeth Acevedo, they should. She's one of my favorite authors. With the Fire on High was one of my all-time favorite books. So if she's banned, that's more reason to buy her. She's a wonderful author and poet, and her voice is really, really helps with showing and showcasing Latinx experiences.
Yeah, something we're trying to do too in our health justice, or not health justice, I'm calling it, it's all health justice and justice. We're trying to learn more about the curriculum in Pennsylvania and look at what the lists are. So also like how many books are kids actually reading that are written by, authors of color, in terms of representation. So we're very interested in that currently, and are starting to do work in that area. But absolutely, Elizabeth Acevedo banned in York, PA, for sure.
Oh, Janine, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I just wanted to applaud both you, Dr. Jimenez Garcia, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name.
It's okay.
Mary.
Pardon me. Mary is fine.
but yeah, I think to be able to celebrate, and I think your Dr. Jimenez Garcia, your questions that are guiding us today, and this idea about like pathways, not bridges, and equity, not just inclusion, and advantages, not just disadvantages. I think that conversation, and also the health conversation about how we're living longer than our white siblings. I think it's interesting because we need to start focusing and celebrating things. Like there's always one single narrative about all of the obstacles and all of the bad things, and the things that are just, all the sorrowful things. And we see that in fiction, we see that in nonfiction, and those stories are really important, but it's not the only story. And so I think the more we adhere to our narratives of our real narratives of celebration of the really wonderful things, the places that we're going, and like the symposium, right? The work that's being done to show that this is like a multifaceted conversation. And Mary, you mentioned intersectionality. And so to show that you can't just pave us all one way. So I just think this is such a beautiful start to this symposium. And so I'm thankful to both of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Edwin, I think your hand is raised.
Yeah, hey everyone, buenos dias todos. I'm Edwin Mayorga, or Professor Edwin Mayorga at Swarthmore College. I was glad I was able to catch this morning session, and just wanted to add to Janine's really critical point here. And I understand that Mary's intention was not to just be a downer at all, but quite the opposite. We have to recognize the invisibility of our community here in Pennsylvania, and what the harms are that we're experiencing. At the same time, I think what this symposium, similar to echo Janine's point, this symposium the history of sobrevivencia, of acts of survivance, not survival, but survivance. How do we thrive? How do we survive? Go beyond survival? If I can borrow from our indigenous brothers and sisters and their scholarship and politics, to really think about the history of struggle here in this state, in our communities. I'm here in Philadelphia, and the Puerto Rican community, the Mexicano community, the South and Central American communities that make up this beautiful city, and that populate this entire state. We have been here and we have been engaged in these struggles, and we need to honor those and teach about them, and educate and really look to continue to groom and support the leadership. And so I'm just really delighted to be part of this community, which I think is an important step in helping us to think about what's wrong, but also to build off of a strong radical tradition of justice work here, of change-making work that our communities have been a part of for a long, long time here.
Thank you, Edwin. I believe we have a question from Professor Suzanne Edwards, as well as Camila Green. So Professor Suzanne Edwards is asking, we're seeing increased development along the 222 corridor, especially warehouses for trucking and delivery to the coastal urban areas that may contribute to increased asthma along that route. What kinds of advocacy and education around Latinx health and the texture data you highlight can help in the Lehigh Valley?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. I think it's a really important question, especially thinking about, social determinants of health, how we live. With the increase of industry, we know that there is usually an increase in families in these areas. And so I think the advocacy is really starting to call out, do we measure this, right? Do we measure how asthma is measured or other environmental factors in the 222 corridor? I think it's also trying to take these data points and be like, is there a real disparity here and how do we start correcting it? We know that asthma is common in childhood, but we also know that environmental factors tend to trigger and exacerbate it, right? From where we live to how we live, right? So we also know that undocumented households generally live in poor household conditions because so much of getting better housing is tied to legal status. It's tied to identification. Getting things like basic utilities are tied to education. And so we see mixed status households or undocumented households generally live in lower, worse conditions, right? From mold to rodent and other pest exposure of feces, right? Which all exacerbate health and asthma. So I think the beginning part is really understanding what the issues are there environmentally, and then advocating around those issues, right? Whether it is intervention programs into households, whether it is trying to get a grant for air purifiers or things of that nature, or grants for people to be able to move to different areas. But there's so many factors that really impact and I think really need to be uplifted. And I'm so excited. I know I saw Miranda's question above about like health networks. One beautiful thing that I am currently working on with the amazing Dr. Lang is we are working in collaboration with the Lehigh Valley Health Network presently on a study, a community-based participatory study, right? Because as Dr. Jimenez said, we can't uplift our voices as researchers if we are not uplifting what is going on in the community, if we're not being real about what is going on in the community. We're not being real about who these healthcare spaces are designed for and how do we start being like, it doesn't feel comfortable going in there. I'm not who this is designed for. And how do you start breaking it down? And how do you work with providers to do that in a way that it's also taking in mind the provider and the other end of the spectrum too, right? And Dr. Lang, if you want to jump in, I don't know if I'm presenting us quite well, but it's really thinking about these spaces. It's thinking about lifting up community research and not saying that my voice is better than your voice, right? I come from the Southwest side of Chicago. I can tell you what happened in my childhood, but you know, I'm new to Allentown. So right now is so much about learning, right? I have to learn. I can't just insert my opinion.
We also have a question from Camilla Green.
Good morning. Excellent introduction. I really appreciated it. And my question is, I've always been intrigued by the Same Boat Coalition in New York City. And I want to know, as an African American, what are the pathways that we can share together in the health market? Does the data, like once we look at the Latinx community and all of its complexity, and we look at the African American community and all of its complexity, when can we come together around what data points so that we can be a stronger force moving forward?
Yeah, I would love to say something about that, because that's part of also like what brought us together in terms of the symposium and the work we've been doing in Edjustice as well. In terms of also like feeling a sense of divide, right, that happens in our community. And I would say it doesn't just happen, because a lot of it is like the legacies of the industry, right? The legacies, and you'll hear some stories about this research as we keep going. But that's certainly something that I feel like why ICRES is such an important space at Lehigh and in the Lehigh Valley, to mine data in a way that doesn't separate our communities and that looks at that intersectional analysis also, right? And doesn't erase also the Black community in the Latinx community, right? So I think that that has also been something that's been really important that our community members have brought to our attention. And I don't know if anyone here has a specific like data point that they would like to bring up, Mary. I know Mary, like, she's like, wait, let me think. But, or Siri also, I know Siri's here, but that let's think about that for if there's something specifically also that you would like to say in regards to that question. But thank you for your question, Camilla. And that really hits at the heart of why we're here.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce what Dr. Jimenez said, and thank you so much, Dr. Green. That's such an important question, and I think it is. It's spaces like this. It's also that I like to tell family members it's not a cookie, right? You're not fighting for a cookie. You're not fighting for the spotlight, right? Where so often a tool of oppression is that we find that we often pit minorities against each other for progress, for health, for all of these things, and it's not the way things can go anymore, right? We need solidarity. We need to be able to say, ouch, that hurts me too. Or how do I lift up? How do I fight for this? And then it's also understanding that like Latinx, it drives me crazy, is an ethnic term. It is not a race, right? And so by saying that there are Afro-Latinos, right? In my area where I grew up, I can remember hearing that like there are no Black Mexicans. And that's just racism. That's racism, that's colorism, and that doesn't help anyone, right? And it's pushing back, especially when elders in our community, I was raised not to talk back, but especially when elders in our community say harmful and hateful things like this, of saying like, well, why? Why do you have to be at odds with someone, right? Is it really helping you? Is it really helping the community around you? So yeah, I think that, and like I was pointing out, layered identification, right? Being able to have better metrics, not this blanket, you know, we're going to make you all one category, because we live very textured lives. That's really important. Crenshaw coined that term for a reason, right?
Okay, we also have a comment and a question by Cynthia Stramara that relates to what you just mentioned, Mary. And her question is, where's the best place to push for increasing the layered identification and disaggregation?
Okay, I can think about that a little bit too, because I think that's also part of like, even in our conversation in our position in higher education, I'm a faculty member, for example, and I can speak to the example of being told sort of like Latino studies, you do this, and then wanting to teach courses that include, you know, Blackness and issues of Blackness, and being told sort of like, well, isn't that Africana studies? You know, so, you know, there's these questions sometimes where we're having to educate a system that really, you know, wasn't made for us, right? But also needs to come up to step to where the research is, quite frankly, in 2021, you know, where we have had a movement, especially in the last 10 years of Afro-Latinx research. And I would also say, you know, again, you know, Asian Latinx, Indigenous Latinx, you know, we have Arab Latinx, you know, not all Latinxes are Catholic, not everybody is, you know, an evangelical Christian, you know, and sort of like for universities, for school systems to catch up with the research. And I think also being part of those conversations is where we're also needed to be part of, not just with, also like, quite frankly, we're going to talk about this in the next panel, but how can we involve parents and families in curriculum decisions, really? You know, what would students like to see represented? So often we don't even think about what students need or want. We're talking about them all the time, but we don't include them in these meetings. You know, so that's something I would also say. I think our university system and our education system as a whole needs to catch up to the research. And I think it is playing a tool in keeping us separated, to be honest, and keeping the work separate. That's my 2 cents, maybe 3 cents.
I agree with that too. And I also think it's like my commitment as an educator is to always, I teach stat most of the time. And in stat classes to be like, well, do you think that's a good form of a measurement? Why, right? Challenging forms of measurement. Right now, I'm really falling down the acculturation rabbit hole of saying measuring acculturation. Is that sort of racist, right? To say that, did you conform enough? So challenging measurement, and also challenging students and those around us in terms of how we measure, in terms of how we think, pushing, continually pushing, and then figuring out how to make this scholarship less inaccessible, right? So much of what I do, I don't ever want to write something that my parents can't read or understand. And I think that that's more of the mindset that we need to start having. How do we make academia more accessible, this research more accessible, and not just to short panels or the 4 other people in the world who want to read this? And I see Tony's question around ethnic identification and will it facilitate separation? I hope not, right? Like, I don't want it to be like, oh, I'm Mexican American, so therefore like Mexican Americans need to be more prioritized. Instead, what I hope with this identification, this ethnic identification work is saying, okay, well, we see Latinx overall has low infant mortality, but Puerto Rican women have higher infant mortality. So how do we support and bolster that community, right? And I think, again, it's just learning to have solidarity as Latinos in the United States, right? We are an ethnic group that comes from many different places, but we need to be able to support one another. We need to be able to say, we need these resources for one of our gente, right? All together. And I don't know how that's done, but I think it's continually pushing back. I think it's continually having these conversations.
Cynthia?
Yeah, I appreciate the responses. I just wanted to clarify in terms of measurement that part of what I think was interesting about your presentation is the comprehensive approach to health and how that involves several pieces of industries and sectors coming together and having that comprehensive understanding. But we live in a place where everything is measured. So I appreciate you pushing back on measurement, because I think one of the problems that's happening in these systems is there is an outdated measurement piece. So we are looking at how this impacts racial disparities and ethnic disparities for lifetimes, but where do we start to insert some of that systems change ability into, to really impact cradle to career, right? So do we start with changing the way that we identify or have opportunities to really layer identification in maternal health, because it's starting like before babies are born, or right? So that I think that was more of my question of like, how do we push back against the way the system wants to categorize us? Because then it continues into daycare, then it continues into the K through 12 system, then it's in the university system. And you're looking at how you identify racially and ethnically throughout your entire life. from before you were even born. And so if we don't start to think differently about how we disaggregate that data, then we're not going to learn how this is impacting us. And the carceral, I see Mayorga's comment in the, so I was just curious about like, where do we think we want to push that button the most so that it has the biggest impact for systems change?
I mean, just like everything you said right there, everything, right? And, my work myself focuses on maternal and child health on a personal level. So I'm starting a new project around Latinx women's maternal and infant health outcomes, right? So thinking about, we as Latinos are always talked about in terms of migration. It doesn't matter our generational status. It doesn't matter that 80% of Latinos are US born citizens. We are always measured and talked about in terms of migration status, right? So the work that I'm doing is around that, but I think it's also starting to think about, I'm third gen. My mom was born here. My grandparents immigrated from Mexico. So do my health factors, if I'm always being measured up against how well I acculturate, how well I am to my grandparents' migration, right? Is that measurement really suiting us, especially as we see that births are where population growth in this category are happening. So, personally, I'm focusing on maternal and child health, but I also think that we need to think about the adults now too, right? We need to think about our health outcomes. We need to think about the communities that we live in. We need to think about our elders as they age, right? And how do we make things better for the future, but also for now? And I don't have a good answer for that, but I hope together we can find one.
Yeah, I was just also going to add, and I think this is also why we're here, and I'm so excited to have these conversations. These are the conversations like I wanted to have when I first got here, and was wondering like, how could we bring together this conversation? But like, a huge issue for, I think also that we're trying to say is like Latino studies, Latinx studies is a framework, right? Like, and it is invested in thinking through issues of colonialism, land occupation. Quite frankly, why are there so many Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans in the United States? Well, did you know that half of the United States used to be Mexico? Did you know that the US decided in 1898 to occupy Puerto Rico, and not extend citizenship until 1917? Like there's so much about Latinx history, like Indigenous history, I would also say, that is sort of like a difficult conversation that people may not want to have because it has to do with the US being a border crosser. It has to do with also legacies of work programs. For example, the Bethlehem Steel, a lot of the laborers who were brought in through this work program and repopulation or depopulation, I should say, of Puerto Rico, and the Braceros program in the Southwest, right? Which was also like this legacy of being seen as labor, but not necessarily being invested in our voting and in our citizenship and in our participation in the democracy, right? So there's a lot that Latinx Studies highlights in terms of these legacies that can be uncomfortable to really settle ourselves with, because we are looking at a US history that is hard for us to see when the land of the free and the home of the brave decides, I'm going to occupy this island, or I'm going to occupy this group of people, right? So and I wish there was more integration and racial solidarity in these conversations, because I think that we can see that with our Asian American communities as well, right? And with our African American brothers and sisters, right? So like this legacy of colonialism that really is a thread throughout a lot of our histories, what can bring us together instead of separate us, is something I'm hoping we can get out of also this meeting. And just so you know, we will be gathering our recommendations and our information, and we hope to publish a policy brief basically out of the symposium by the Institute to gather our wisdom, and to make it something that we can disseminate also perhaps to those who weren't able to come today. So that's just something I want to make sure I say before we end.
Good morning. My name is Rhea Levy. I've been listening to the conversation, and I'm and especially, what Cynthia was saying about culture and identity, and also this divisive nature that we have and why we think the way we do when it comes to culture and Blacks and Hispanics and Latinx and so forth. I remember back in the 90s, I read an article that the New York Times did a series, and they were talking about culture and identity. And they interviewed a white Cuban and a Black Cuban. And they said when they came to America, and these two, and let me just backtrack a second, the two of them were friends while they were living in Cuba. And when they came to, when they both moved to Florida, Miami, and when they moved to Miami, they noticed that they were being separated. They're no longer, associated with each other because one moved to a Black community and the other moved to a white community. And so, it's like America, this is America. This is what America has done to us. America, and it's structured like that purposely. And I think once we realize this and we try to educate our children, because again, they're the next generation. I'm always speaking about our children because America is implanting these ideology into our children's minds. And so once we realize this, and once we as adults, once we realize that this is what they're trying to do, this push and pull, this just trying to pull us apart by putting one above the other because you're light skinned, because you're lighter than a black person, so therefore I am going to give you that job, or I'm going to give you a certain position. And so this is all psychologically done. Within the school systems here, for example, within the Bethlehem area school system, the kids are not in the classroom, the kids are not even seeing a Black face. And it's affecting the white kids as well. And they're not realizing this. And when they realize, and this is why there are all these psychological, mental health that's going on within the psyche of our children as well, is that, it's like they're capturing this picture and they're wondering, why are they behaving the way they do? And so you don't have a Black person standing in front teaching. They will put them in administrative duties and say, we're trying to do equity, diversity, and inclusion. But what about them standing in front of the classroom and teaching the kids? The kids need to see that. So there is this divide, and there is this again, this power structure that they're creating to divide and conquer us. And so we need to realize it's the divide and conquer. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any, that was a great comment. Does anybody have any other comment or questions?
I just had a quick comment. I wanted to just highlight and agree with everyone about how white supremacy is really essentially the main enemy, and that racial and ethnic solidarity and resistance requires us collectively to reject white supremacy. But and this is not but to say that other parts don't matter, but it's also really important to, this is a sort of a Latinx in Pennsylvania conversation. It's really important to also highlight that we cannot necessarily assume that the way that white supremacy works and the way that it marginalizes every ethnic group or every racial group is the same, that white supremacy is not enacted in a singular fashion. And so because of different unique histories or uniqueness of particular histories of oppression, that it's really important for us to be collective as a group to resist white supremacy, but also to recognize the different histories and the different ways in which whiteness finds its way into different communities and in oppressing them. So it's not to say I'm responding to the comment of if we have these different categories or different groups of the larger Latinx community, is that problematic? It's not. the same way that we have different groups of marginalized and oppressed people in the America, that it's not problematic because there are similar ways in which they are oppressed, but there are also particular and unique ways in which white supremacy really impacts different communities, and being aware of those differences is also important. And yeah, Raha is absolutely right. Like white supremacy, if there's one thing that it has continuously done successfully, is to be able to divide and easily conquer marginalized and minoritized groups. So I just wanted to add that.
Yes, I would also say like, we're gonna have a day of dialogues, right? So this was the opening, and I'm so excited that like these issues are coming up, and these are the issues I think that were on our hearts as we were planning. But later today, right, we're gonna have at 4:15, for example, there's a panel on colorism that we're gonna be doing, that we're gonna be hosting. Right after this is the Edjustice panel roundtable, and then after that at 1:30 is the research in our communities. So I encourage you, stay with us for the day, learn with us for the day, take breaks, obviously, but stay with us for the day because it's woven throughout, and we would love to hear more of the conversation as it continues to develop over the different panels.
Thank you. So yes, we will reconvene here at 11:30 to learn about Latinx Studies in Pennsylvania with Dr. Vivian Robledo and Dr. Edwin Mayorga. So we want to thank you for your time and all the comments that you made. Your input into this conversation was really great. So we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I am going to end the meeting, which means the recording is going to end as well. Thank you so much, Alonzo and Mary and everyone who was here. Thank you. See you in the next one, if you're there.
Everyone.